All right, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending on where you are in our fine country today. And thank you very much for joining us for the Canada Strong and Free Network's February webinar discussion, virtual discussion on a topic that has been in the news a lot, but you might not really know a ton about because there's some new language, some new terminology that I think is being introduced to help us make sense of what's going on when it comes to the problem of political discrimination in Canada. Many of you will, of course, recognize me from past virtual discussions that we've hosted at the Canada Strong and Free Network. But if this is your first time joining us, certainly we welcome you. My name is Jamil Jivani, and I'm president of CSFN. We are in the peak season at our organization, getting ready for our next national conference, which is in Ottawa on March 22nd to 24th at the Westin Ottawa in particular. And I certainly encourage anyone who has not bought their ticket yet and would like to join us, please do make your way to Ottawa, or if you're already in Ottawa, it should be an easy trip for you. It's the biggest conservative networking event of the year. And this one will certainly live up to the hype. We've got a bunch of our speakers for our Ottawa conference already announced, and I want to sort of remind you of some of the folks who will be there. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith will be one of our keynote speakers in Ottawa. Also, the Manhattan Institute's Rehan Salam. He'll be coming in from New York City. He is one of the preeminent conservative thought leaders on urban policy, and we're very thrilled to welcome him at our conference in March. American Reformers' Aaron Wren, another key thinker on conservative urban policy issues, will be present as well. Modern Miracle Network's Michael Binion will be there, as well as the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Kaveh Shahrouz, who many of you will recognize from his very important speaking in Canadian media recently over what's happening in Iran. So we have a very diverse, interesting group of speakers already confirmed. You have many more names that we'll be announcing over the next few weeks. Certainly the biggest one that we've announced so far is the former Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Stephen J. Harper. He will be speaking at our conference in March and will actually be kicking things off on the evening of March 22nd. So we encourage you to be there for that as well. Of course, it's going to be a fantastic lineup. The early bird prices on tickets are still available for all 3 days, March 22nd, 23rd, and 24th at the Westin Ottawa. So please do register now if you'd like to be there. We hope to see you there as well. Before that conference, we have one more free virtual event that we're going to be doing in early March, and that's going to feature some of the youth leaders in the Conservative Values Tomorrow program that we've started. Many of you will recall from our listserv or our social media posts that we've got this mentorship program for conservatives under the age of 30. We're in our first year, and it's been a fantastic experience. Some really interesting, bright, amazing future leaders of our movement are participating. And so you're going to hear from a group of them at our next free virtual event, which will come up in a few weeks. So be on the lookout for an invitation to register for that in the next couple of weeks as well. Of course, today we will be having a really important conversation with a member of parliament from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta. Garnett Genuis is with us, as well as employment lawyer and partner at Levitt Check in Toronto, Kathryn Marshall. And before I introduce them and sort of have some questions for them, and certainly you're welcome to contribute your questions as well in the chat. We will be monitoring that for your thoughts, any questions you have, comments, feedback. I want to just do a little bit of an overview of the issue and help sort of set the stage for our conversation today. The term political discrimination is one that you probably haven't heard very much before. It's a very particular type of discrimination, one that frankly doesn't impact a lot of the elites who shape media narratives. So you don't hear about it as often as you might hear about other kinds of discrimination. But it is a reality of what's happening in the world today, particularly in our country, where there are people who are being targeted by employers and cancel culture activists and others for their political beliefs. Now, political beliefs, of course, a very broad term, and we are going to kind of dig into what that means. But the most obvious example in the news recently has been one that I'm sure you've heard about, which is sort of the, let's say, ordeal facing Dr. Jordan Peterson at the hands of the College of Psychologists of Ontario. Now, as a very brief and concise overview for those of you who might not be aware, Dr. Jordan Peterson is facing a disciplinary measure from the CPO that is requiring him to do a re-education program because of some of the comments he's made on social media. Now, there's a broad range of things that he comments on. I mean, he's obviously an in-demand thought leader and public intellectual. So we could sort of point to a number of things, but the CPO is very clear. They provide examples in their, let's say, argument for why Dr. Peterson should be re-educated of tweets that he's made that they object to. And some of the tweets are political in nature, the types of things that any citizen in a democracy should be free to say in their free time as an individual human being and not face disciplinary measure from a professional regulator. One of the tweets that he sent out that the CPO in their own words points out, this is in their words, this is not even what necessarily Dr. Peterson has said, but you can see reporting on what the CPO has said, where they are upset that Dr. Peterson called Justin Trudeau a puppet. Now, lots of Canadians will have different views on that, and certainly that's not necessarily an objective statement. The point is that Dr. Peterson is entitled to that political opinion, that political belief. And the idea that a professional regulator overseeing psychologists in the biggest province in Canada would object to someone saying that Justin Trudeau is a puppet on Twitter and potentially take away their license to practice psychology over that. I mean, that's what we mean when we say political discrimination. It's extreme, it's prejudicial, and it's also limiting people's free speech in a democracy where being able to say critical things about the head of your country is actually really, really important. And my hope would be that regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, and of course, we are a conservative organization, so most people listening to me right now would probably identify as conservative. But we do have a lot of people who watch our stuff and attend our events from other parts of the political spectrum. And whether you're a liberal or a socialist or whatever your views might be, I would hope that you also would want the freedom to criticize the head of our country when you might not like who the prime minister is. That's something that Canadians across the political spectrum should probably be able to agree on. Now, of course, those of you who followed my career will know that this is a topic that is sensitive to me in particular because of my own experience with political discrimination. And I think what's important about my experience is that it highlights how political discrimination can interact with other kinds of discrimination, things that may be more traditionally seen as human rights protections in Canada, but certainly become political depending on how, let's say in my case, a big corporation might deal with the issue through their own HR and diversity policies. And of course, I'm talking about my experience with Bell Media. Bell Media, ironically, maybe not ironically, let's say coincidentally, uses a similar term in their defense of why they fired me. In their statement of defense, again, in their words, not in mine, in their words, not in someone else's, they say one of the reasons they fired me is because I allowed a caller to my radio show to call Justin Trudeau a globalist puppet, and I did not correct the caller. Again, that word is interesting, that people seem so sensitive about the prime minister being called a puppet. But that is the exact same situation where I had an employer who did not say to me, you have to defend Justin Trudeau in my job agreement. In my employment contract, we never said that was part of the expectations. And yet they deliberately say in their statement of defense that that's one of the reasons why they fired me. So when we say political discrimination, this is what we mean, that there are people being punished for having legitimate political views. This is not extreme ideas that are on the fringes somewhere. These are things that you might actually hear in our House of Commons. And Justin Trudeau has been called a puppet in our House of Commons by duly elected members of our parliament. And yet being able to say that, if you are a psychologist, or being able to say that, in my case, or allow someone else to say that in a media company, is now being seen as a fireable offense. So these are the kind of real life examples that I'd like to encourage you to think about. That we're not talking about an abstract idea that might affect people someday, somewhere across our great country, but rather political discrimination is something that is affecting people now, today. The biggest media company in the country has admitted to it. One of the biggest and most influential professional regulators in Ontario has admitted to it. This is factual stuff in their own words, and this is why the conversation we're having today is so important. So I'm very happy that we've got not just someone who can speak to the issue from a political perspective, one of the lawmakers in our country, a member of parliament, but also an employment lawyer with us who has the expertise on the legal side on the kinds of things that are affecting workers. And one thing I would just underscore before we open the conversation up to our guests today is that when we look at what's happening in the country right now, we see very clear and stark problems impacting working and middle-class families. The majority of workers, the majority of employees in this country are working and middle-class families, parents, students, people who are easily impacted by the decisions of a big corporation, of their boss, of an employer, of people who yield an unduly amount of power and influence in our economy, in my personal opinion. And that's one of the reasons why this issue is important, because we know who it impacts. The people most vulnerable to being discriminated against based on their political beliefs when it comes to employment law or employment situations are people who need a job, who are working hour to hour, paycheck to paycheck to pay off their bills. And when we think about the impact of this stuff, the political left, a lot of people who would identify as progressives, who claim to represent the interests of working middle-class families, are typically silent on this issue. And that's one of the reasons why conservatives have to be vocal. We have to talk about the things that are impacting working and middle-class families, especially the things that folks on the other side of the political spectrum aren't particularly interested or enthusiastic about discussing. So that's, I think, the context for what's happening in our culture, in our politics right now, and why this conversation is so important. We're very grateful for you to be joining us. And I'm going to start off by welcoming the Member of Parliament for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta, Garnett Genuis. Garnett, welcome. And maybe you could start off by talking about the bill that you introduced in Parliament, the bill, an identical version now before the Senate of Canada, and why you thought it was so important to bring a legislative response to the problem of political discrimination.
Yeah, thank you, Jamil. Thank you so much for all the work you do and for the opportunity to speak about this important issue. Bill C-257 is the same as Bill S-257, the Senate version. Both have been proposed. Senator Salma Ataullahjan in the Senate, myself in the House of Commons, and the bill's being seconded by Dr. Leslyn Lewis. There were many different kind of strands that came together. I guess one is just a sense that people shouldn't face discrimination for any reason, and just it would be wrong for someone to be fired or denied service because of their race, their sexual orientation, their their marital status, etc. It's wrong when people face those same kinds of discrimination based on their political belief. And the way our human rights jurisprudence works is that we have a list of enumerated grounds, and so I'm saying that we should simply add political belief, and that's what the bill does. It adds a political belief or activity as prohibited grounds of discrimination alongside a long list of other prohibited grounds. Now, if this bill were to pass, there would be the kinds of natural limitations on the expression of that right that exists for other criteria. There's such a thing as a bona fide occupational qualification. So you can't discriminate on the basis of someone's religion, but if you're a church, you are allowed to hire someone who shares your faith. So there are instances where there are reasonable exceptions, and the same would apply in the case of political work. If the Sierra Club is hiring someone and they don't want to hire a conservative, well, maybe fair enough. But outside of those narrow particular cases, people shouldn't face discrimination. They should never face unjustified discrimination in accessing employment or services on the basis of their political belief. So in a way, it just seemed like, oh, well, if this isn't the law already, then surely it should be. And in fact, in many provinces, there are protections for political belief. I think the other thing going on here, though, is political discrimination threatens the vibrancy of democratic debate and the idea for sort of existing orthodoxies to be challenged. We want to have the kind of robust democratic society in which a person can put forward and champion unpopular ideas, and those ideas can be subject to criticism, but people shouldn't be reluctant to put forward contrary ideas for fear that they will face employment or service-related consequences as a result of that advocacy. And sadly, we see this more and more, this impulse to punish people personally for having the wrong views politically. If I see somebody advocating for a position I don't agree with, I'm going to want to challenge their position. I'm going to want to engage them in potentially sharp dialogue about those positions. But I can't imagine wanting to personally punish that person, make their life more difficult, disrupt their ability to provide for their family, etc., just because they have a view that I consider to be wrong. And yet, the trend is very much in this kind of hyper personalization of politics for people to seek to punish those who have the wrong opinions, and that creates a big chill, because if people who lack a certain level of power and privilege, maybe they want to put forward ideas that are contrary to established orthodoxies, but if they have to calculate, well, if I lose my job, that's going to cause all kinds of other problems for me, and it's just not worth it. Then our debate is impoverished as a result of that. I guess the final thing I'll say, just in the introduction here, is some people say, well, wait a second, political belief isn't like race, or it's not like gender, because those are immutable characteristics. But human rights codes already protect people on the basis of characteristics that are not immutable. Marital status, is one example. Religion is another example. Religion, marital status, these are things that are very important to people, but they're not immutable. They're things that people choose to enter into and can choose to change their status with respect to. And I think the same goes for political beliefs. Political beliefs are deeply, sincerely held. They're not immutable, but they take the form of a personal characteristic in that they reflect deeply held, deeply considered convictions, and therefore they deserve similar protections.
There we go. Always mess it up one time. They're unmuted now. So thank you, Garnett. Before I get Kathryn's perspective on the issue, I just had a follow-up for you, which is what you've heard about this since you sort of started to talk about the issue, since you first presented the bill in Parliament. What are the reactions you're getting? Are you getting a lot of support for this? Are people apprehensive about the idea of including political beliefs and activity in the Canadian Human Rights Act? What is the reaction you've received?
Yeah, so I guess a few different kinds of reactions. I don't get a lot of very sharp opposition to it. There's certainly a lot of people who, because of things they've experienced or observed, they immediately get it. They say, yes, this is something we need in Canada. So that's one group of people. Another group of people sort of, maybe want to nitpick a little bit. They say, is this really the same as other criteria? Is this really necessary? And sort of opens it up for me to make the case that it is necessary and that it is important. And then I guess there are people that are concerned. They don't really understand human rights jurisprudence, so then they think that sort of any kind of lawless behavior could be justified in the name of political belief, and that's not how human rights jurisprudence works, right? If I say that my religion teaches that I should go out and break the law and hurt people, well, I'm not protected by human rights law. There are limitations to these protections, and they exist within the broader framework of a rule of law society, and within the kinds of constraints that are proposed by other other human rights protection. So, clearly, if someone says my political belief is to pursue a violent workers' revolution and kill the capitalist class and install a dictatorship of the proletariat, well, that political belief isn't gonna isn't gonna enjoy complete protection, right? So, for people to just understand that. There's an existing body of law that shapes how these laws are applied. What I'm simply asking is that political belief and activity be considered alongside other characteristics as something that is worthy of protection. And so, those are the reactions that span this. The spectrum from people that are enthusiastic to people that are unsure to people that are kind of looking to nitpick or immediately jump to the extreme case here. But I think that there's a lot of room to make these arguments, and I feel like the more I talk to people, there's some people that maybe are initially skeptical, and then you have the conversation. They say, okay, well that's reasonable. So the more we talk about it, I think the more people are getting persuaded by it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And just to sort of add a bit more to one of your comments there about this existing at a provincial level. Of course, you being a member of parliament federally, you're introducing this to be a federal change to the Canadian Human Rights Act. But at the provincial level, there are protections for political beliefs. In Quebec, for example, there's a provision for political conviction. Prince Edward Island, they also define political beliefs as policies or ideas endorsed by a registered political party at that given time. And so there are ways of making sure that this is really about being focused and about on our democracy and protecting free speech for people to participate in our country's political system, and not sort of being hijacked by people with some of these, fringe interests as Garnett has described. So
yeah, let me just quickly add to that the technical point, because I didn't address this, and I think it's important to clarify. So the Federal Human Rights Act deals with the federally regulated sector. So that's about 10% of the economy. If you face discrimination in actually most aspects of your life, then you're going to want to pursue that issue provincially. Federally, the sectors that are regulated federally, we're talking about interprovincial transportation, telecom, social media would be covered by that. So it isn't everything, but as far as political discrimination goes, since this covers big telecom and social media, as well as action by the federal government, federal crown corporations, and interprovincial transportation, there's a lot that would be covered by my bill, but it wouldn't cover Dr. Peterson's case. Dr. Peterson's case would be a provincial issue in Ontario, and Ontario is one of the few provinces that doesn't have these protections, although many other provinces do.
And that certainly is an interesting point, that the biggest province in Canada in terms of population does not have a protection for political beliefs, something to take note of, certainly. And I think that's a great segue for us to welcome Kathryn Marshall into the conversation. Kathryn is a partner at Levitt Shake, an experienced employment lawyer. Kathryn, what's your take on political discrimination right now? Does it alarm you what you're seeing in some of these news stories? I think you might be muted, Kathryn. Happens to the best of us.
Oh my gosh, yes. No, it does really alarm me. I see it a lot in my practice. The past few years, I've had many cases of people consulting with me because they were hauled into HR meetings and confronted with things they had posted on Twitter, or events they'd gone to, or causes they had donated to that have nothing to do with their job and nothing to do with what their employer does or the services their employer sells. And it just seems to be, I think, rooted in this rise of companies wanting to be part of like the activism culture, where you have like this corporate identity that's sometimes rooted in a specific ideology, and they expect their employees to comply with it, even though it has literally nothing to do with their job or what they're doing as a corporation. And it's really troubling because, of course, a person's job is really fundamentally important, and that's their ability to put food on the table. So controlling people's behavior and their political activity using their ability to earn a living is something that I'm seeing a lot more of, and it is deeply distressing because, like in the case of Dr. Jordan Peterson, you wonder like how many professionals, for example, have muted themselves and silenced themselves from participating in public debate because they're worried that they're going to be taken down by their regulator. You know, how many people are out there not participating in politics or sharing their opinion on issues because they're concerned that they're going to get in trouble for it. So you have people removing themselves from the political sphere, and that's not a good thing for our democracy.
And Kathryn, I guess I have two questions for you in terms of just helping us get a sense of maybe the bigger picture here. So the first is the problem getting worse, or are we just paying more attention to it? That would be my first question. And then relatedly, what do you say to people who feel affected by this? What can they actually do about it? What kind of remedies exist? Because until, you know, a bill like what Garnett's introduced has been passed, are there other options people can explore?
The situation is definitely getting worse. Like it never used to be the case that, you know, for example, professional regulators cared what you know their licensees were doing and saying and believing, as long as it didn't violate, you know, codes, you know, the actual rules, like, you know, you can't have lawyers out there committing fraud, for example. So this is all new, and this idea that like employers seem to care a lot more about their sort of public corporate identity, and I think it's rooted in cancel culture. I think that's actually the root of it, because it is really easy to get someone canceled, and it is easy to really damage a corporate reputation just because something's trending on Twitter. So I think a lot of companies are just a lot more like cautious, like they have social media policies, they have, and it kind of like permeates into a lot of people's private lives. And I think also just like wokeism, this kind of notion that like, you know, corporate identities need to be wrapped up in whatever opinion is popular that week. And of course, we know that that's always changing. You know, I will say I've never had a case involving someone who got disciplined for having liberal views. It's always small c conservative views, or like you know, I mean, I had so many clients over the past few years who were disciplined or talked about for expressing a view about COVID, about what the government was doing and the regulations and mask mandates. And so, you know, yes, it's getting worse. There are things that people can do about it. Obviously, having discussions like this, like just talking about it openly, is really important. You know, what Garnett's bill is all about, which is adding political protection to human rights codes. I mean, everything else is protected. I don't know why this is not in there. You know, just fighting against that cancel culture that exists. I'm a big advocate of that. Like, I've had many clients who've been canceled. Being canceled is a horrible, isolating experience. It actually traumatizes people, like if employers would just, you know, leave people alone and let them just do their job, and like recognize there's a difference between someone's identity at work and what they're doing outside of work, and not interfere, you know, and just ignore if someone's trending for like an hour on Twitter, because who really fundamentally cares? I mean, that would go a long way. But, you know, the opposite is happening. There's like more control is happening. Like your case is a perfect example, Jamil. Like there's, you know, it's getting more silencing, and in a less overt way too, which is really concerning.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Kathryn. I think we've had a couple people ask questions in the chat, in the Q&A chat there, and please do continue putting questions in there. We will get to some of them, as many as we can. But I did want to comment on one of the things raised in some of the comments you received, which is sort of the distinction about political beliefs compared to other protected grounds on the Human Rights Act. Today is February 1st, obviously, as you will know, which is the first day of Black History Month. And I really like Black History Month, despite the fact that I often fight with woke liberals over race politics. I think Black History Month is very important because it actually is a way of cementing into our historical narrative how far we've come and how much progress we've made, which is very easily, I think, lost in the way we talk about racism today. But what is important to note about how discrimination against political beliefs can interact with other kinds of discrimination, Black History Month sort of highlights that too, which is that a lot of companies, including my former employer Bell, but this has become far too common across the board, now employ people from Black communities as part of a political narrative at the company. As Kathryn mentioned, a lot of companies want to engage in activism. So if you're a Black man or woman and you're hired by a company that says, we're hiring you to fight systemic racism in Canada, they've inherently made your job, your very presence in the company, political. You might not actually believe Canada is a systemically racist country. You might actually believe Canada has made tremendous strides over the years and is a place where, on average, most people can move here and not be limited in their opportunities based on their ancestry or their skin color. And many people have worked very hard for Canada to be a place like that. But when someone hires you and says, well, we're hiring you because of systemic racism, they've now made you part of a political message that you didn't actually choose. And then if you disagree with that political message, now you become an inconvenient Black employee. And that's what I mean when I say political beliefs interact with other kinds of discrimination, because what other kinds of discrimination do are try to put people in boxes from various communities. And then if a member of that community has a political view that management might not endorse, well, now all of a sudden you become a problem, even though you're exercising your rights in a democracy just like anyone else would. And for me, at least, I would say that's a big part of why I find this type of stuff problematic, because when you look at the careers, the lives of many of the activists and lawyers and advocates and political leaders who have made progress possible for Black people in this part of the world, they often said things and did things that management didn't like, that corporations didn't like. They had to actually challenge power, and they had to say some tough things about their elected officials. And risking your career and your ability to provide for your family to tell those truths seems like the exact opposite of how we got to the point of progress that we're at today. So that's another reason why, even in Black History Month, I think it's important to have a conversation like this. Okay, let's get to some questions for our guests. Garnett, I want to start with you. Drea has raised a couple of questions on medical professionals, people in the healthcare industry being discriminated against. Given sort of the timing of your bill, the fact that the pandemic's been dominating so much of the news headlines over the last few years, I would suspect that you've heard from people who feel that this would be important in the healthcare industry for healthcare professionals. Do you have any comments on what this might mean for people affected by political discrimination in healthcare?
Yeah, so would want to be transparent at the outset about the fact that that almost certainly, if we're talking about regulation of professional designations in healthcare, it would be provincial jurisdiction. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the importance of opposing political discrimination and encourage provinces to adopt legislation similar to the one that I've put forward. And I mean, the legislation I have doesn't define political beliefs. So I think there'd also be some potential ambiguity around, okay, what constitutes a political belief. I don't know that it would cover, for instance, personal medical choices. That's I think a worthwhile thing to explore, but that's a different piece of legislation. But I think we are seeing instances of discrimination against healthcare professionals around like some of the sort of traditional issues of conscience, right? People being pushed in terms of their medical practice. There's a College of Physicians and Surgeons policy I know in Ontario that mandates referral even if people have conscientious objection to, for instance, euthanasia. So that's very concerning. I see that as a form of political discrimination. But again, it would be one that would have to be addressed at the provincial level.
Kathryn, have you encountered any cases from healthcare or any unique situations that healthcare workers might be facing? Oh, you're muted again.
No, I keep doing it. Yeah, I mean, healthcare is definitely one of the most impacted industries when we're talking about political expression. I've had many chats with doctors over the past couple of years who've told me, Kathryn, I used to have a Twitter account and I deleted it. And I used to say things, I used to express opinions, and I just don't do it anymore because I'm terrified of the College of Physicians disciplining me, and I can't lose my license to practice. And I think that's really, really troubling. And it just didn't used to be this way. And I've seen a lot of people in the medical field who have been disciplined for just expressing views that don't fit within like that, mainstream kind of government narrative. And like, I'm not talking about views like, oh, people saying like, oh, COVID's not real. I'm not talking about stuff like that. I'm talking about like physicians expressing or medical professionals expressing like intelligent, science-based opinions on issues, just like lawyers or any other professionals do when it's their area of expertise. And there's nothing wrong with that. But like this threat that the kind of cancel culture mob has latched onto lately of going after a professional's license is getting a lot of traction. It's worked. Like, I mean, we don't hear about most of these cases. Like Dr. Peterson's is obviously in the news. I mean, most of these cases you never hear about. But the mob has realized they can be effective in silencing people by going after their jobs. And they keep doing it because it keeps working, and it works really, really well. When you mess with someone's money and ability to earn an income, that becomes a very powerful tool. And of course, we have regulators and employers who are really just making it so easy for these people to silence their, people they don't agree with. Ultimately, they don't agree with the person, and that's why they're doing it.
Jamil, I did want to pick up on the point Kathryn's made a few times here about corporate power. I think that's really, really important. And that's the other kind of strand here, which is historically the left has been the critic of corporate power. They've been the ones saying, we don't want large, powerful corporations stepping on workers. There's been a sea change in the way the left approaches the issue of corporate power. Now the left wants to use corporate power to push its own ideological objectives. And very little now will you hear liberal or left-wing politicians talk about talk in a serious way about big corporations in negative terms. I mean, it's still there a little bit with the NDP, but they mix it with saying corporations should do this or that to push a particular woke cause. And there's a great book called Woke Inc. that I would recommend, which advances the thesis that kind of after the Occupy Wall Street movement, corporate elites made this accommodation with the progressive left, which was all about, we will push woke ideological causes, and then you leave us alone to preserve our economic power. And so it's fallen to conservatives to be the voice of working people, of freedom, to recognize that that large monopolist corporations working closely with government to push ideological causes are every bit as much a threat to our freedom as governments acting in past ages.
Yeah, very well said, Garnett. And I think we should be a lot more confident as both kind of big C conservatives and small C conservatives in delivering that message, because the truth is that we live in a time where economic inequality is getting worse, not better. We live in a time where very wealthy, powerful people are telling the majority of our country that they are privileged because of race or because of gender, while the masses of middle class and working class people are seeing less benefits from spending their own money. It's not going as far. Being able to afford a house is becoming more of a challenge. And let me throw another shot at Bell Media while I'm at it. While we're paying the highest rates for cell phones in the entire world, right? I mean, and then we're being lectured to that people are privileged, and we should be keeping our mouths shut and not talking about what's going on in our lives, because rich people would like for us to be parroting their talking points. It's a difficult pill to swallow for a lot of Canadians, and I certainly don't blame people for being frustrated. But what I think is exciting about what Garnett's doing with his bill, what's happening in the Senate of Canada, with what Kathryn's doing in her legal work, is that we can find productive outlets for the frustrations we feel. And that's how we're going to actually make some changes, I think. Okay, Garnett, I want to go back to you because you have a question from Charlene Desrochers. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, who makes a point that I know you've explored on a podcast, I believe, last year. She says, Indigenous people suffer from political discrimination by chiefs and councils. Can you tell us what you've heard about that?
Yeah, well, simply put, this bill would cover concerns about political discrimination involving Indigenous people on reserve. People that face political discrimination or perceive they've faced political discrimination could bring those issues forward to federal human rights bodies and seek their support and adjudication of those matters. So I think that's one of many applications, but I think it's an important application. Certainly, I've heard anecdotally people that suggest there are particular cases where having this remedy available would be very valuable.
Okay, Kathryn, next question for you. This is from our buddy Rizwan Mohammed. He asks, can any of the panelists speak about political discrimination in law enforcement and the armed forces? I noticed in the past year that a Canadian Armed Forces Advisory Group comprised of former leading members of CAF recommending to their federal minister to not hire chaplains who don't agree with their diversity policies. The think tank Cardis published a memo on this issue. Any thoughts on that, Kathryn?
So I do a bit of work in the military. I've sued the military numerous times, and I have a bit of insight into how it functions. It probably surprises no one who's on this panel or listening today that even the military has been impacted by wokeness and cancel culture, which is like very ironic, because if you look at the military, they have a lot of other issues they should be addressing, like their rampant sexual misconduct problems. But if political discrimination protection is added to the Canadian Human Rights Act, it would apply to any federally regulated sector, including the armed forces. So if you're personnel in the military, you're still covered under the Human Rights Code. But I think like one of the problems with political discrimination that I've seen is, like all forms of discrimination, these days it's quite subtle. Like I mean, it used to be, decades ago, discrimination was like very overt. We didn't have like laws protecting people. So like you literally would have employers like in their ads, like advertising for positions, like just saying like we only want women of this certain demographic or men of this, So discrimination has become a lot more subtle, and it has become kind of covered under a veil and guise of something else. And that's what I find, like what a lot of employers use their equity and diversity policies as a way of saying of basically discriminating against people who hold different views by saying, well, oh, this is about equity, this is about diversity. But the irony, of course, is that, I mean, diversity means diversity of views. And that's what inclusivity means, is like you are tolerant and inclusive of different views, even if you don't agree with them. But what happens is like people get pulled into these meetings and they get disciplined for saying or doing something, and that doesn't comply with, the corporate viewpoint or people's view, the mainstream views. And then the employer is able to say, well, actually, so it's a violation of Section 5 of the Equity and Diversity Policy, and because you're in violation of it, we get to do X, Y, and Z. And then you read the policy, and the policy says, we will promote inclusivity of views. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. But it's hard to argue with that. We don't really have, we don't live in a society where you can really challenge these policies. And that's why your case, Jamil, is really important, because we're actually saying in that case that, equality means equality of views too. That's what that means. You can't use these policies as a weapon to go after people that you just don't agree with. And it actually nullifies the validity of those policies.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, as Kathryn will know, in Bell Media's statement of defense in our case, they actually quote me saying that diversity of thought is important, as if that's like a gotcha against me. I'm like, what's controversial about that? Isn't that the whole point of diversity, is that people are going to come in with different life experiences and points of view, but they somehow thought that was like a gotcha moment. Just some of the things we're dealing with, people. All right, let's move on to the next question. This is from Gordon Lee, who I think is the Gordon Lee that we work with in our Conservative Values Tomorrow mentorship program. So I'm really glad he's able to join us, if that is in fact the Gordon Lee. This is a question for Garnett about what you might have heard from provincial governments about this issue. He asks, currently, the vast majority of provinces are governed by Conservative premiers. Are there any efforts to narrow the regulators' powers to punish individuals for their political opinions, as we've seen with the LSO, Jordan Peterson, the College of Physicians, and most recently the Law Society of Alberta?
I am not aware that that's been a significant area of activity by provincial Conservative governments. Far be it for me to give them advice, but I do think it would be an important area to explore. But and you look at the situation in Ontario with the College of Physicians and Surgeons policy, something that I'm familiar with because I have physicians in my family, although none of them practice in Ontario. I think I think provincial Conservative governments should make sure that that their commitment to freedom and liberty, to freedom of expression, is being reflected in the actions of institutions that have delegated authority from them. We're not just talking about sort of private clubs that exist in the province. We're talking about bodies that have delegated authority, and so I do think some work could be done there. I know there's always lots of different things on the agenda, but it would be a good thing for provincial legislators to explore. And like one simple step would be take a version of Bill C-257 or S-257 and put it forward in the provinces that don't currently have those protections.
Makes sense. And I think certainly at minimum, provinces that don't have some of their own legislation in place, like Ontario, may want to consider adopting legislation similar to Quebec or PEI. I think I read on Garnett's website that 9, I believe, of Canada's 13 provinces and territories have some recognition of protection for political beliefs and activity. So
yeah, and it varies. And I should say, once that legislation is in place, it doesn't mean the work combating political discrimination is done, right? I think there are still problems with political discrimination in jurisdictions which have some of these protections. You're better having some protections than none, because it gives good lawyers like Kathryn an additional thing to point to in making their arguments. But I think further steps are also required in terms of making sure that that those concepts are really fully applied throughout the system, so that people can once again feel that, if they have a political opinion that's, even if it's contrary to the majority, they can go out and express it without worrying about being punished.
All right, next question. We're going to try to get through as many of these as we can. Thank you so much for dropping questions in the Q&A chat. Next one I want to go to is from Karen and Gordon, another Gordon. We'll send this over to you, Kathryn. Will this legislation impact a bank's ability to debank individuals for political opinion? Is banking covered federally or provincially?
I'm not really sure. I don't really understand the comment of like debanking, but the banking
I think it's probably a reference to what happened with the Emergencies Act, where people's bank accounts were frozen. I think that's probably what they mean.
Yeah, it would. I mean, no, if it was added to the Canadian Human Rights Act, which applies to every federal entity, and banks are federally regulated, that legislation also applies to like any service provider. So I mean, basically, you cannot discriminate against anyone for protected ground, and so I think that legislation would be helpful. And if someone wanted to challenge the actions of a bank in discriminating against a customer on the basis of politics. Garnett made a good point. Like, look, a lot of this legislation, sometimes it doesn't have much teeth to it. And I often hear people say, well, what's the point of, having some of these laws? They're never followed, like people ignore them. It's just words on a paper. But what it does is it gives lawyers like myself and others, as Garnett pointed out, like something to really launch a claim around, and something to a really concrete legal position to take that is like unequivocal. And that's why it's significant to have it in the law. And that's why it's important that this bill passes, because otherwise we're just sort of left arguing like about how something is a right. And I see people in the comments mentioning the charter, and like charter, of course, the charter rights are really important and significant, but to have it in the Human Rights Code, where there's actual like really clear processes and remedies, like you can file complaints based on code violations, that's very significant. And so it is something that I think every legislator, I don't know why any member of parliament wouldn't want to get behind this.
And Garnett, maybe we'll go to you with this next one. So we've got a question coming from Gatineau, nearby where you are at the moment, about how people can stay in touch with like-minded folks who are concerned about this issue, perhaps affected by the issue. I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to this who feel like it's impacting them in some way. What recommendation would you make for how they can actually do something about it, and how can they find other people who are concerned about the problem of political discrimination?
Yeah, I have a petition up on my website, garnettgenuismp.ca. If you go to the petition page, I'll try to find the link to the specific petition just in the time we have left and put it in the chat. But if people have specific stories, I'd love to hear from you at the office as well. I'm easy to find online, and please do share those stories with me. We tend to hear about the higher profile cases of political discrimination, the case of Dr. Peterson, your case, Jamil, but both of you are people that already have some degree of platform, and you're people that are in politics in some sense, and therefore kind of know how to communicate in response to these kinds of things. You've got a pre-existing ability to push back. There are a lot of people out there that just don't, right? There are people who maybe they don't think much about politics, but they had a thought on an issue and they put it out there online, and then they're getting bullied by their employer over it. They can't imagine going through all the steps that maybe are more familiar to us as political people. So I don't often hear those stories. I know those stories are out there, but if you're facing political discrimination, I want to hear from you. And please, folks, sign the petition, and that will facilitate you continuing to receive regular updates from me about this issue.
And Kathryn, I guess from a lawyer's perspective, do you have any suggestions for people who are listening and concerned about what they could do if they feel they're being discriminated against right now?
I mean, definitely come talk to me, shameless plug, but no, in all seriousness, don't let it slide. That's how this type of discrimination gets worse and permeates, is that people don't challenge it. And I know that it feels really uncomfortable to challenge your employer. I get that. It's very uncomfortable. And of course, you're always going to fear reprisal and retaliation. But if you think that you're being wrongfully treated or retaliated against or sidelined or mistreated because of your views, make sure you document that and have a meeting with your boss or HR where you're addressing it. And you're, you ask them where, have them point to the section and the policies of the company that say that you can't say or do something, or can't participate in the political activity. Have them be specific. Don't let them kind of, tiptoe around it and be like, oh, well, you made Sharon by the water cool feel uncomfortable when you talked about watching, Jordan Peterson's podcast. Make them be accountable, hold them accountable to it.
Well said. And of course, if you do feel isolated or kind of marginalized in your workplace or your community, if you're looking for like-minded people, I would highly encourage you to come to one of our events. Our next conference is in Ottawa in March. In the fall, we'll be in Red Deer, Alberta. We'll be in Toronto, and in other cities we do smaller events as well. And so on our listserv, you'll be made aware of those. And we hope you'll come out and just meet people, because building relationships, building community is a big part of how we all get through this stuff. Being able to know you're not alone, and to know that there are people who will have your back if you're standing up for what's right, if you're standing up for your rights in a democracy that guarantees them. You're not by yourself in that struggle. So I would encourage you to come out in person to something we're doing if you can. The other thing I would say is, I do write about these issues very often for the National Post and the Toronto Sun. So if you're trying to get attention on something that you think is an injustice, feel free to send it my way. My email is jamil@canadastrongandfree.network. As Kathryn said, you can reach out to her as well. And Garnett also has that petition. So you know how to kind of connect with each of us, connect with the Canada Strong and Free Network. We really appreciate you joining us and taking some time out of your afternoon or your morning, depending on where you are. We thank you very much and look forward to seeing some of you in Ottawa, and hopefully seeing some of you at our next virtual discussion. Take care, everybody.